Hey, with everything that's going on right now, comic books seem to be an insignificant part of this whole pandemic situation. But to comic fans, comic professionals, comic shop owners, yeah, it's not so trivial, is it? It's kind of affecting our corner of the world in a big way. Some businesses are winners in this situation. Comic books are not one of those areas. Um, we're looking at publishers unable to reach the public, comic shops facing disaster, and the major distributor of comic books in the country appearing to be insolvent. So it might be a good time to look back and talk about how comic books actually are marketed and sold. And to the question, how are comic books marketed? The answer is they're not. And I'm going to show you how. A little history lesson here. Okay, back in the 30s, um, the magazine hit its golden age. You had your slicks and you had your pulps. You had Saturday Evening Post and you had Doc Savage. Well, the slicks kept on going big time. The pulps were starting to run their course toward the end of the 1930s. Sales were going down, and the number of titles were being cut. Now, because many of the publishers ran their own printing presses, this was an intolerable situation. It meant that printing presses that were formerly running 24 hours a day now had nothing to print, or not enough to print. That wasn't making anybody happy, not the publishers and not the printers. The public had basically gotten tired of the pulps, and so these guys had to find a new way to make money. And some genius got the idea that just to keep the presses going, just to keep the paychecks for the printers coming, why not put together a cheap collection of comic strips? The material was already there. It was relatively inexpensive to license it. And so they put together, this is one of the earliest ones, Famous Funnies. And it just collected a lot of the newspaper strips of the day in a cheap 10-cent magazine. And it sold like gangbusters. I don't think they expected that. Remember, their intent was, let's just keep the presses running. They weren't looking for a hit, but they got one. And all they had to do to make this hit happen was stick the stuff out on the newsstand. And kids, for the most part, gobble it up. A dime a piece? What a deal. I can read comic strips that I missed. Well, after a while, there weren't enough comic strips to go around. They were running dry on this thing. And so they began to create new material. But even then, all they did was create the new material, stick it out on the newsstand, and the kids bought it. And the only way they knew what was popular and what wasn't was by the returns. Comic books were returnable, just like every other magazine or newspaper on the newsstand. If it didn't sell, it went back to the publisher to be pulped or discounted somewhere else, or whatever publishers did with their returns. But that's the only way you knew. And if you could publish something and get at least, stay below 50% returns, you were at least breaking even. Any better than that, you were making cash. Well, a great example of this is Action Comics #1, the first appearance of Superman. For all intents and purposes, the beginning of the superhero era, and a hallmark of the golden age of comics. So DC puts this thing out, or National Periodicals, or whatever the company was called at the time. And, basically Superman was the idea brought in by two teenage kids, Siegel and Schuster. And legend has it that Superman almost didn't make it into the first issue of Action Comics. But there was when they were putting the thing together, they decided to stick this new feature in. And they actually had to trim a couple of pages to make room for it. So they publish this thing, and they have no idea how it's going to go over. And so they publish 5 more issues. of Action Comics without Superman. It's not until about the third issue, they're probably working on the third issue to put it to bed, when they realize there have been no returns from Action number one. It's a total sell-through. Action number one sold 100% of the copies published, and none came back to be pulped. So, hey, let's get those two kids back in here. So, issue 7, 6 issues later, 6 months, Superman returns to the comic books. Now, you think at this point, they would think, well, let's find out why this sold, who it sold to, and basically gear toward that audience. No, they didn't think that way. All they thought about was, let's do more of the same. Let's add more titles. Let's add more of these, long underwear characters to our lineup. And eventually, this leads to a rich landscape of comics through the 40s and 50s. All kinds of comic books get put out there. But there's still no marketing. They don't do anything but stick them out on the newsstand and hope they sell. And then when they sell, they move into something called redundant publishing. So redundant publishing is I'm trying to adjust my camera here. Redundant publishing is if there weren't a lot of returns on a book, do more of them. So here we see the war comics sold. Let's do more war comics. The romance comics sold. Let's do more romance comics. And romance comics were a big deal. Girls were a huge part of the comic buying audience. If you look at sales records, they're probably even bigger part of the audience than the boys were, because romance comics sold in the millions. Now, most comics sold in the millions, or they wouldn't be profitable. But I think young romance routinely sold 3 million copies a month. That's enormously profitable, especially when you consider the low page rates they were paying writers and artists. This stuff just didn't cost much to produce. And in the 1950s, you had a lot of comic book millionaires created off of 10-cent comic books. These things were extraordinarily popular. And they did it all through redundant publishing or redundant marketing. They didn't know who was buying them. They didn't know how to reach the people who were buying them outside of ads inside the comic books. And they didn't even really seem interested. They weren't reaching out to their audience. More importantly, they weren't reaching out to a new audience. They were just putting them in the drugstore, on the newsstand, and they would sell, and they would watch the returns as an indication of how well or how poorly a book was doing. So, that's what was going on in that market. Now, it still went on, redundant publishing into the 70s and 80s. If you struck on some gold, you leaned into it. You kept doing that kind of thing. And, it's a smart way of doing business, but it's not a long-term way of doing business to just live on a hope and a prayer. And it really wasn't until Stan Lee came along and tried to change how this stuff was done. And Stan called it plateau marketing. And what he would do is he would start the little kiddies off on a comic book they would like. So he's going to grab the 7 to 8 year old share of the market, and they would graduate to Spider-Man. So from 9 until 12, and then they would graduate to the magazines, the horror magazines, and Conan, Deadly Hands of Kung Fu, things like that. And then ultimately, Epic Illustrated, which would be a comic book for grown-ups, for adults. And so Stan's idea was that to carry the readers cradle to grave through Marvel product. And it was a good idea. And it was the perfect time for that idea, because in the 70s, comic sales were falling apart. And in a large way, This saved Marvel Comics from extinction. This reaching out to new readers. It was a worthy experiment, and it sort of steadied the ship for a long time. But still, it was the newsstand where everything was bought, and it was still a crapshoot because of returns, because of returnability. And then along came the comic shop, what we fancifully call the direct market. Comic book shops began to open, and they wanted to buy direct from the publisher. They didn't want to deal with the news agencies. And the comic companies, saw this as an opportunity, particularly new upcoming comic book companies like First and Eclipse. They saw this as an opportunity because they certainly were never going to be able to go through the news agencies, but they could market directly to comic shop store owners. Now, out of that grew distributors. Someone needed to distribute these things. The publishers weren't going to do it. They didn't know how to do this kind of stuff. So they were going to handle it through distributors. Now, at the beginning, there were like maybe a half a dozen distributors spread all over the country. And comic shops would decide which distributor to go with. Over time, they were, run out of business, peeled away, whatever reason, and we were left with Diamond. Diamond Comics was the only game in town. And here's the problem. It compounded the fact that comic book publishers never marketed their material, never thought about marketing their material. Now they had someone to market it for them. And all they had to do was get in this big book. And Diamond would handle it. Diamond would handle promotion and decide, what was going to be the hot title. Diamond would control the industry. And as we can see in recent days, this was a suicide pact. Because as Diamond's fortunes went, the comic book industry's fortunes went. If Diamond failed, the comic book industry failed. Not only the publishers, but the comic shops themselves. So we're in a really weird place. The other thing that came along with Diamond was an emphasis on superheroes. Now, this kind of began in the late 60s, early 70s as fans became editors at Marvel and DC, and they wanted to publish the kind of comics that they liked. So there was an emphasis on superheroes, and every other genre was sort of kicked to the curb. And so we end up with everything in one basket. We've got one genre sold by one distributor through one system. And whereas newsstands reached a wide general public, the comic shops only reach the devotees. No one walks cold into a comic shop. They either discover the comics on the newsstand and then are eager to find more, or in most cases not interested at all in finding more. And then they become devotees and they find their way into the comic shop. Most of these comic shops, as we're certainly learning now, are really severely undercapitalized. We're seeing comic shops go out of business because they simply cannot afford a bad month. And it looks like we're going to have a couple of bad months. So we're going to come out the other side of this pandemic with fewer than half the number of comic shops that we went into it with. So you have this, these enormously valuable intellectual properties that have been around for 80 years, have captured the American imagination for 80 years, and they are basically run through a funnel of one distributor and one retail outlet, run by, and none of it, all along the chain, apparently none of it was capitalized. None of it was built to survive any kind of hardship or downfall, market downturn. I mean, if it wasn't coronavirus, obviously another recession would simply have put these people out of business. And so where does the comic book industry go? I don't know. I really don't know. But in a lot of, as I think I've made clear here, a lot of it is at the fault of the publishers who failed to market their own property. I mean, everybody from the milk marketing board to people who grow cabbages know you got to have somebody out there knocking on doors and walking the pavement, actually pushing your product, introducing it to new consumers. And comics have never done that. If anything, their history shows they have retreated from mass appeal. They have retreated from the consumer by leaving the newsstand, by fashioning their work into one genre, and then further whittling it down through their interest in politics or their lifestyle or whatever commentary or agenda they had, further whittling down that superhero audience to I don't know what the audience is for comics now. You know, current comics. Um, you know, I picture a guy, you know, a hipster in a hat that's too small for his head, and he lives south of 14th Street in Manhattan. Um, that's their audience, and that's what they've done, and they've done it to themselves. And it's not this current crop of publishers and editors. It's basically comics have been doing this all along. And I'm sure there are other industries that have done the same thing. You know, they've basically made themselves irrelevant. And that's what's happened here. So that is why I say, how are comics marketed? They're not. So anyway, hey, if you liked this video, I have more of these on a channel called Unauthorized TV. And it's a subscription service, and I think I've got about 30 videos up there. There's about 20 more in the hopper waiting to go on, and they're much in the nature of this, instructional or anecdotal, or you know, something about the history of comics that you may not have known, or if you're a longtime fan, you may have forgotten. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope we all see it through this okay. I hope there are still, you know, comic books on the other side of this, but you know, and there will be. It just won't be the way that it is now. But I seriously think that a lot of life is not going to be the way it is now come fall. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I will see you down the road.